Good morning, fourth graders. It is Miss Ferguson and it is Monday, March 30th. Today we're going to be doing a lesson has a PowerPoint about the American Revolution. You know that we've been studying the Revolutionary War in ELA by using divided loyalties and other examples of texts and documents and even pictures from the Revolutionary War. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about some information we've already learned and some new information on News ELA. You will be reading an article about patriots and loyalists. You will be taking your quiz and then you will be writing your response to that, which is typed up on there for you to make it easier. So, the Revolutionary War movement in America. As you know, America wasn't always a free country. In fact, at sometimes it was a pretty miserable place to live for a lot of the people in the colonies. And this was because those early settlers, those early colonists who lived here, were expected to still live under Great Britain's rule and follow their rules, including some rules that were not very fair. The war didn't start right away. There were a lot of protests and problems that started it and led to it gradually over time. Some of the biggest complaints that the colonists had to do with unfair taxes and rules. But the colonists thought it was unfair for them to be taxed without any say in the government, and they wanted to show Britain that they had rights. We've already talked before in class about some of the events that led to the American Revolution. And our guiding question for the module we've been working on was, how does someone's view of the revolution and their life experiences impact the side that they were on? So some of the causes that we've talked about were, first, the French and Indian War, which we are going to learn a little bit more about today, the Stamp Act, what was known as British Imperial policy, the Boston Tea Party, which we are all very familiar with, and the colonists were tired of Britain charging them high taxes and controlling them. And remember, we talked about how Britain felt like the colonies were becoming too independent and they wanted to take back some of that control. So, in order to do that, they enacted some of these things like the Stamp Act and other policies. The French and Indian War. A lot of people think that the French and Indian War was between the French and the Indians, but it was actually between France and Great Britain. Both sides had American Indian allies. Allies mean someone that's on their side. The French and Indian War was important because, as you know, it put Britain into a lot of debt, meaning they owed a lot of money that they had to pay for the war. And so part of the reason why they taxed the colonists so much was that they had to pay that money back. Britain and France both wanted control of America's western land. So the French decided to come over to America and take over the land that was already claimed by the colonists. During the French and Indian War, several battles took place over 7 years. Finally, they signed a peace treaty, and France had to give up the land that they had claimed. So they had to give the land back to Britain. While this was a great, exciting win for Britain and even the colonists because they were living on that land, it was also a very expensive war to fight. The American colonists started to get taxed at high rates for their goods in order to pay off the expenses from the French and Indian War. So, who was fighting in the French and Indian War? Think about that for a second. It was France and Great Britain. And how did the French and Indian War lead to the Revolutionary War? Think about what we just said about who the war was between and what it led to and why Britain had to do certain things. The American colonists started to pay higher taxes because they had to help Britain pay off the war, and they did not like being forced to pay those taxes. The British Imperial policy. What that was is because the British were so in debt, and debt is when you owe money, King George III decided to make many new policies that the colonists had to follow. Tax laws were made. They made strict rules that they enforced, and they changed leadership. The British even put troops in America to make sure that everyone there was obeying those new policies. The Stamp Act. One of those policies that Britain put in place that the Americans thought were unfair was the Stamp Act in 1765. Great Britain put a stamp on all printed goods. Newspapers, magazines, and legal documents were all taxed. One example of a legal document we talked about which was a marriage license. It was called the Stamp Act because the colonists were required to buy paper from Great Britain that had an official stamp on it showing that they had paid their tax. The colonists felt that the British government had no right to tax them because they didn't have a say in how much taxes should be or what those taxes were used for. They didn't think this was fair. The colonists refused to pay, stating no taxation without representation. And this made Great Britain very mad. What that means is they felt if they had to pay taxes, they should have a representative in the government to help make decisions. So after that Stamp Act, groups of colonists began to join together. One group, and we've talked about them, was the Sons of Liberty. They wanted to show Great Britain that they had rights and Britain couldn't tell the colonists what to do. So let's quiz ourselves for a second about the Stamp Act. What was it? Great Britain put a tax on all of their printed goods. They called it the Stamp Act because the colonists were required to buy paper that had an official stamp proving that they had paid their tax. How did the Stamp Act help lead to the Revolutionary War? The colonists felt that the British government had no right to tax them because they didn't have a say in how much taxes should be or what they were going to be used for. And they didn't think it was fair, so they were very angry, and it caused them to come together to take a stand against Britain. The Boston Tea Party. We've talked about this many times in class, especially when we've been reading Divided Loyalties. Late one night on December 17th, 1773, a group of colonists boarded 3 different ships filled with tea. They threw all 342 chests of British tea into the British harbor. Why did they throw the tea out? Tea was a favorite drink in Britain and in the colonies. The colonists were told, though, that they could only buy tea from the East India Trading Company. In addition, they had to pay high taxes on that tea. And that was called the Tea Act. They were very angry about all the taxes that Britain kept telling them they had to pay. So they decided to take a stand and show Britain that they couldn't be told what to do any longer. The tea thrown overboard added up to over 90,000 pounds of tea. Tea brought in a lot of money for Great Britain, so it was a big deal when the Americans threw it all in the water. Because to Britain, that was basically a ton of money of theirs that was now gone. So, quiz yourself. What happened during the Boston Tea Party? Those angry colonists threw all 342 chests of British tea into the Boston harbor. The colonists were not happy about paying the taxes, and they started to protest more against the British government. The British continued to tax many goods like tea and stamps, which made the colonists even angrier. Eventually, this started a revolution in the 13 colonies that changed their lives forever. We're going to be moving on tomorrow to some major battles during the Revolution. I want you to think about today, the Patriots and the Loyalists, and how their viewpoints and the events leading up to the Revolution were so important. When you're reading your article, you should be close reading. You should be highlighting words that are difficult, and you should be even taking notes like you are close reading in the classroom. And then you're going to answer your writing prompt about the different sides in the revolution and why someone might choose to be on that side, and use your rad and provide at least 2 details of text evidence. We will move on tomorrow, like I said, to more information about the revolution, because this is quite a lengthy PowerPoint, because the Revolutionary War is quite a lengthy ordeal and there's so much information for us to learn. I can't wait to see you girls. I hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you tomorrow.